Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a trauma-informed therapist, life coach and disruptor of wellness norms based in Brighton, UK. This isn't another nice-to-have wellness podcast. Instead, this podcast seeks to redefine what it means to be well in today's world. Here, we challenge the status quo, seek to reunite wellness with social justice and improve accessibility, diversity and inclusivity within wellness and beyond. As a listener, you are not here to passively consume. Instead, you are an ambassador for real, embodied, societal and systemic change in the world. As your host, I stand for radical self-inquiry and being able to have those confronting but necessary conversations so that we can remember our collective humanity at this time. We're here for the revolution and you've got a front row seat. David, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you here.
You're welcome, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I would love for you to introduce yourself in any way that feels most alive for you today.
I'm a men's dating, relationship and intimacy coach. I focus on helping men create deeper and more meaningful connections across the areas of love, relationships, sexuality, but also with themselves, because that's a really important aspect of when we create deeper connections. Externally, we have to actually venture internally, which is the part that often we don't want to do, but that's the part that needs the work, particularly of men, because we are socialized into externalizing of everything. I'm also a partner. We've been together for about 7 years. I'm a son. I'm a brother to a lot of siblings. I've got lots of younger brothers and an older sister and younger sisters. I'm a father to a little 22-month-old son, which is been a real shift in life and perspective over the last kind of couple of years with that. I'm a podcaster myself. I'm a speaker. I've lived a pretty wild life in many ways. I've lived an adventurous life. I say up to this point, some stories that I can't air at all, but I've been someone who really look to enjoy life and get the most out of it for many, many years.
I always say that I'm very pleased that I grew up in the era where smartphones weren't really a thing. So I imagine that our wild paths are slightly less well documented than they would be if we were doing the same right now. Before we go on, I'd so appreciate you to hit follow or subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, click those 3 little dots next to settings to rate the show. On Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review or take a moment to explore how you can rate or review on the platform that you're listening or watching. This makes a difference. I truly believe we need to have more of these conversations to shake up the status quo. We'll beat the algorithm together with your clicks and shares. Now back to the episode. So as context for those who have not come across your work, what was the trajectory of you getting into the work that you do today?
There's a story that spans almost 20 years. Up to this point, 20 years ago, I would have been 22 years old. I would have not long come out of university, and I would have felt a level of frustration around dating, especially in those times. That's what I was focused on. Why am I not meeting the sort of quality of woman that I want to meet? I was just done a computer science degree. I had a decent job. I liked to travel. I was interested in the world. I liked to go to talks and seminars about anything from money to space to time, all these sorts of things. And I kept meeting women who were more interested in getting drunk and buying the latest handbag. And it wasn't of interest to me at all. So I picked up a little book, like many people did at that point, called The Game. And I read that book cover to cover, even though a friend of mine explicitly told me not to read it, which probably was the reason I did read it. And that friend, we're still good friends to this day. And that set me on a journey of learning about the mechanics of dating and how people connect. Then it took me into some teaching and helping men around that area for a number of years. And then I left that. And for the next kind of 10 years or so, 10, 12 years, I was in my tech career. I still did plenty of self-development. I did a lot of travel. I spent at one point 2 years traveling around the world where I did some plant medicine, and I started to see my life very differently and see myself emotionally very differently and connection very differently. And then that led me to come home, start a podcast with a friend of mine who just asked me one day to do that. And that podcast kind of spawned into my business now. And, it also strands things like learning about Tantra and learning about emotional capacity and men's work and nervous system healing and all these sorts of things that brought in to direct me into this work. And I guess I would just add one more thing is I had a coach at one point probably about 7 years ago. And he did a process. It's called MetaMyth. I have the video on my laptop somewhere. And he said, he works very intuitively. He was like, your job is going to be to help men who are behind you that are wanting to move forward in their lives to where you want to get to. And I said, I don't want to be a fucking coach, mate. And he was like, it's not about what you want to do and want to do. This is what's in your destiny. And it's very funny to see that that's pretty much what I do now with men, is help from wherever they are in their life, whether they're struggling emotionally or relationally or with their masculinity and sense of power, and helping them move forward to a sense of, holistic groundedness, connection and happiness.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I saw on one of your posts that when you went traveling, you had quite a challenging breakup, and it meant that you were looking at your relationship patterns in a different kind of way. It seemed like that was quite a big catalyst for you getting into the work that you do now. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. It is a big part, because I think without that relationship, I'm deeply grateful for that relationship and my ex-partner there. Because when I met her, I'd given up my belief that relationships could work. When I first met her, we dated and saw each other for probably about 3 months. And she was like, look, I like you, you like me. Why don't we be together? And I said, I don't believe relationships work. And I think it's best that, if that's what you want, I'm not your guy. And we did this on and off thing for about a year. And then we got together and did another 3 years together. But without that relationship, I would have stayed really apathetic towards relationships and even negative towards them. But the breakup occurred because over the course of a year that we were traveling, I just wasn't expressing what I wanted. I wasn't expressing how I felt. I was becoming very negative. I was looking at her from the perspective of all her things I didn't like about her. And there was a distance that was being created between us. And over that year, there was distance. And then one day we went out to a bar in a place called Sucre in Bolivia. And a woman came up to me to talk to me. And this doesn't happen. Women don't approach me. It's not something that really happens to me in bars. And she started talking to me, and I was like, humoring her. And she was like, who are you here with? I'm here with my girlfriend. And then she left. And then she came back again a second time and was like, okay, talk to me some more. She's like, you don't have to lie to me. If you don't want to talk to me. I said, it's not that. And I'm really here with my girlfriend. And then the third time she came back and she was like, where is this girlfriend? And I said, look, she's right in front of me. And I looked up, my girlfriend had disappeared. And this was the end, basically. By the next morning, we had broken up. She'd taken her stuff and gone to stay with a friend. And that breakup, I lay on that bed at that moment after she had left. And I cried lying there. And I thought to myself, I'm not letting this happen again. I'm not letting myself get into a relationship and it break down because of my inability to communicate, to emotionally regulate. I didn't say these words to myself at the time, but it was more about my ability to express what I was feeling and my ability to ask for what I needed in the relationship and move past this fear of saying things and doing things that would hurt my partner, and how that had really ruined our relationship in so many ways. And also the way that I could look quite negatively at partners. And so after that, I became very determined to do something about that over the kind of coming years.
I mean, breakups, relationship challenges can be some of the biggest breakthroughs, can't they? And I know that I have had huge catalysts in becoming who, I guess I am today through the breakdown or failure, so to speak, of relationships and what that illuminated to me about my own patterns. I'm curious for you, what did being a man look like to you growing up, and kind of what narratives were you fed about perhaps who you should be in a relationship? What did that look like when you were growing up, and how do you feel like that led to you showing up in relationship later on?
It's a great question. What was the narratives that I got? There's kind of competing narratives, because there were some narratives of what I saw. My dad and my mum were together up until I was 3 years old, so I have no memory of them living together or anything like that. My dad is quite emotionally shut down. He is quite selfish. He isn't great with empathy or understanding children in particular, which make him quite a bad father, to be honest, in my opinion. So that was one of the imprints of just aloof, distant man who kind of I see sometimes, but is generally grumpy and angry with me. And then my mum got remarried when I was 8 years old, or married for the first time when I was 8 years old. And initially I thought this man could be like the father I wanted to. There's an instance where he took me to play football, something my dad never did, in the park. And then once my mum and him got married, I remember going over to him, this was as an 8-year-old boy, bringing him with my ball and being like, can we play? And he was like, no, I'm tired. I'm sleeping. I'm going to sleep. And I don't think I ever asked him again. And I don't think he ever offered. And that's really he just descending into being tired, sleeping, and being aloof and infidelity with my mum and so forth. So that's one of the imprints I got as well. And then I saw a lot of relationship breakdown. And then I think another imprint I got was through music. I listened to hip hop, R&B, rap music through my life, through my childhood especially. And that imprint was just bitches and hoes, right? That's what the music I was listening to. It wasn't about love. Some of the R&B stuff was a bit more about love, but predominantly it wasn't about loving relationships and caring and taking care and being tender and being emotionally available. It was like, have as much sex as you can. So that's what I did. And then I started to see that I got a lot of attention from other men, or at least not so much attention. It was more, I call it man points. You get man points from other men kind of acknowledge you and go, oh man, you're a great guy. Like, women love you. Like, you're great with women. It gives you a sense of confidence boost. And when you never got that from a man, a father in your life, that's what you're looking for to some degree. So then that shaped me. In my 20s, once I got good at dating, I became very proficient in meeting women, being very charming, being very fun to be around, very honest about my desire not to have anything serious and to, have a good time and have casual relationships. So that was my imprint, and that's how I operate in relationships. But it also meant that I lacked the ability to do conflict. I would just shut down. I didn't speak my needs. I could be very rigid in my ideas and thoughts towards partners. I could be very short. I was very rule based, like this is how it is, and this is how it's not. So very heady as a man. And it meant that being in a relationship could be really fun and interesting and cool and do fun things and go to fun places. But it also could mean a lot of stonewalling and defensiveness. And I think that was definitely very hard for some of my partners I was with.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And when you had that relationship breakdown and the fallout of that, you painted the picture of lying on the bed, going through the processes of, I'm never going to let this happen again. What did the next steps look like for you in the weeks, months, years to follow?
So I guess, this happened in Bolivia. I think within a month, I had booked in to do ayahuasca in Peru. It was something that I did. And it wasn't actually connected to the breakup, in all honesty, because I had planned to do it anyway. I'd heard about ayahuasca about a year before, just before I was leaving. A good friend of mine was going on a retreat that he wouldn't tell me about until afterwards. It was quite funny. He was like, I'm not telling you where I'm going. I was like, why are you not telling me where you're going? So then I did it in Peru. But obviously one of the questions there for me, I went in with into my ceremonies with, was like, what do I do with my partner? Because, we'd just broken up. So there was still a possibility of rekindling. I guess over that next 6 months was a lot about just connecting with people very honestly and openly. There's a lot of just like very honest connections that occurred between the people that I met as I was traveling through the top of South America. And then I guess coming back was like, okay, I know I want a relationship eventually. Like, am I ready for something? I saw, even off the back of my travels, there was probably 2 women that I met who I really had a beautiful connection with. And then one of them, I fell back into an old pattern of avoidance where, she was traveling around Europe and I called her a couple of times, didn't answer. And I was like, okay, you're busy. I'm going to leave you to it. And I just didn't call her for 2 weeks. And I remember she called me once and was like, yeah, David, but you just kind of disappeared. And that's not what I want in my life. And she was so clear. She was just like, that's not the energy I want in my life. Like, it's great knowing you kind of thing. And I remember thinking like, oh shit, I thought I'd done something about this. So I guess after that, I did a lot of work with a man called William Whitecloud. And a lot of inside of his work was, the creative orientation, intuition. There's also a lot of shadow work of like looking at your darkness and looking at some of your destructive habits and patterns. So it was a lot of that. There was a lot of emotional processes to do around everything from breath work to men's retreats, psychedelics. Like there was a lot of like, how can I feel? How can I feel more and express more? How can I be more honest? How can I be more open? And I guess probably the last thing I'll say is one of the biggest pieces of work I think that showed up was I decided that I was like, I don't think I want to be in a monogamous relationship. So I'm not doing that. And I was very honest and very straight. So I investigated non-monogamy and I dated from that place for probably about 2 years. And I was very honest about it. But what it actually really taught me was to communicate, because I would be myself in situations where I'd have to tell women that I'm dating and going, hey, I'm this thing that you may not like. And I'm just going to be honest about that here right now. So I always say that was one of the most important aspects of my growth, was that period of non-monogamy, because it really made me train in the tools of honest communication under pressure, in difficult situations, expressing information I knew may pain or upset my partner to some degree.
Mm, mm. It makes so much sense. And what ways do you show up in relationship now that would be a surprise to a past version of you, do you think?
You know, one of the simplest ways, actually, and it's funny, an old client of mine sent me a message a couple of days ago about asking for permission to, he was going to be seeing a female friend of his that he had some past history with. And he was asking me like how I feel, should I ask my girlfriend permission, blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, I said, even hearing the word permission still triggers something in me
Mm-hmm.
where I used to feel that if I had to not justify my behavior, but if I had to ask my partner to do something, I felt like I was being controlled. So I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
ask, I wouldn't kind of check in. I'd be like, I'm doing this thing. And they'd be like, okay, can we talk about this? And I'd be like, no, because I'm doing it. I'm free to do what I want. Whereas now, even before we had a little one, it would be like, oh, also I'm thinking about doing this retreat, like it's about these dates. How does that work for you in terms of maybe what you want to have planned for us? Like, does that work with your work schedule for me to not be around? I will
Mm-hmm.
ask these things to kind of check in a way that I would have never done before, because it would have felt like I'm asking for permission, and asking for permission felt like I was a child and my partner was my mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, God, when I look back at some of my relationship patterns, I think that's a way of like also showing how much we've grown at this point,
Mm.
I hope. I am curious what, you work with men 1-to-1, work retreats, etc. What patterns would you say are the most common for men repeating in dating and relationships that you see?
I think one of the overarching patterns men experience is avoidance, and not necessarily just from a kind of attachment style point of view. Is we will avoid, irrespective of attachment style, we will avoid conversations, we will avoid topics, we will avoid asking questions, anything often where we might have to lean into feelings that might come from a partner or potential
Mm,
date that we might be uncomfortable with, or a topic that we might be uncomfortable with, we will avoid. So really what it is they're avoiding having to feel and experience their
mm,
own emotions, right? They don't experience it in that way, or they, sometimes they might not word it in that way, but it's like, I don't want to have to feel discomfort or be in the presence of discomfort as
mm,
well, or cause discomfort. So
mm,
it leads to this avoidance of so many things. It can be avoidance of being honest, which can definitely lean into dishonesty and hiding information. It leans into avoiding being authentic, right? It leans into, avoiding asking for what we really want and saying what we're really about and after. So this is something I see so often with men, is that they're dating or they're in relationships and they want to be the man they want to be. But what gets in the way is they're avoiding doing that because of the kind of mental ideas and stories they have about either the meaning or the implications of them being themselves, them showing up, them asking
mm.
what they want to ask, or them showing up as the men they want to be.
And where do you feel, listening to conversations on your podcast, on other male practitioners that I follow, these conversations in the mainstream about the man box, where do you feel like what you've just explained there of avoiding emotions and avoiding discomfort, where do you feel like those central narratives sit for men in the way that men have been raised in our society?
Yeah, so there's like the socialization of man, right? It's so multi-layered, Part of the
Yeah.
socialization is the patriarchy. Some of the socialization is capitalism, and you can't
Mm,
really separate capitalism from patriarchy. You can say some of this socialization is around Eurocentric ideas and even beauty, right? And then you start getting into like the man box, which is this kind of idea that there's certain rules that we must live by as men, be
mm,
strong, be straight, don't show emotion apart from anger and lust as well. I think lust is one of the allowable ones as well in there. Don't be feminine, don't be gay. Like a lot of these very simple rules that we live by. And the fact
mm,
that that man box or kind of masculinity, not really masculinity, we would call it precarious masculinity, fragile masculinity, is the adherence that we can have to those rules. So the
mm.
problem is that every moment of a man's life, he is basically being scored by an invisible group of judges. Like, how
Mhm.
manly are you being in this moment? Am I adhering to these rules? Like, I walk into a shop and I see a pink t-shirt and I think I like that. Suddenly those judges are like, dude, that's gay. That's feminine. And suddenly the man's like, there could be a great kind of comedy skit about that as I thought about that. Like, he's like, oh no, okay, ooh, I won't do that. He with some friends and someone says something about getting their nails done or cutting their nails and buffing them. And suddenly he's one of the judges and he's like, dude, that's what girls do. And that other man's slightly shamed. And we're just living in this constant experience, right? Like you can see it on Instagram sometimes. I might post something about being loving and caring and feeling your feelings. And some guy will comment and go, that's gay. And you're like, okay, thank you for your mature response. So what it kind of causes in relationship is you go into relationship, you go into dating, and you're constantly feeling like you're having to prove your manhood, right? So, or there's also the picture of like, if you don't believe your manhood exists in that way, then you're judging yourself or you're assuming that she's judging you too. So say I go on a first date, and I sit down and I'm not being confident. I don't appear confident. Maybe I'm feeling nervous and anxious. Suddenly I'm like, oh my God, she's judging me. I can't be like this. I need to be a different way. So then I have to perform and pretend to be something else because that's what I've been told that women want all of the time. And then the bill comes and I'm like, oh God, the bill's a lot. I have to pay. I have to pay. There's no choice. I have to pay. Maybe I can't afford to pay. But maybe by paying for this bill, I'm suddenly blowing out, some of my weekly food shop for next week, but I have to pay, right? So I pay for the bill. Maybe there's some other things we do later on or the next date I have to pay. I have continually believing that my manhood and my worth as a man is on the line based on my ability to adhere to the man box, is based on my ability to provide financially, only financially, really. My ability to some degree is to say protect, but really it's about protection of ego. Really, the man box is about protection of ego, not really protection on a more deeper and important layer. And then the procreate is not so much about ability to actually procreate children, but the ability to get sex, right? As I said earlier about me, right? You get a lot of man points from other men if you are the sort of man that can have a lot of sex and that women desire. But if you're not one of those men, again, you feel like your manhood is on trial by the other men around you, but also by the internalized judge and jury that you have in your mind. And this sort of thing wears away a man's self-esteem, self-confidence, makes him have to perform in certain ways. It can make him a misogynist, it can make him racist, it can make him homophobic, transphobic, all those things. But that might not really be who he is. That might just be who he feels he needs to be. And I think this last point I want to say here is really important. Who he needs to be safe in the world, because acceptance and safety for men is so important for us, right? It's important for everybody, but how we relate to it often is by acceptance and safety within groups of men. And it's, it feels very deep, that rejection, from group, men feel it really deeply, right? I think part of that is because we aren't socialized into the emotionality enough, right? That we can't have compassion for ourselves and we can be so self-critical. There's so many of these factors that's operating that cause men to struggle in dating, struggle in relationships. And sometimes it's the big things, like anger. And then sometimes it's the small things, a bit of defensiveness, it's a little bit of shutting down and never expressing emotions or not asking for help when we need it, or even people pleasing. You can fit inside the man box as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's unbelievable to consider the amount of harm that comes from the man box on men, just how crushing that is for men across the board. And, what we're seeing now, I mean, I know that you watched the Manosphere documentary. I watched your very in-depth 2-part analysis. I was like, wow, this is impressive. And also listened to the podcast this morning where you and Bernie, What Makes a Man, were talking about the Manosphere as well. And that's obviously being presented as one solution to what men are experiencing now. And then there is the alternative route of men such as yourself guiding men towards a different way to evolve. And I'm curious how you see the way out of the man box for men looking in that direction.
The way out of the man box. It's hard. If you're honest, if you've been, we look at, say, religious indoctrination, right? That can happen from a young age. Like I went to church from a very young age, and religious indoctrination gets into every aspect of how we see ourselves often, right? For people. So even when they want to leave in their 20s, it's powerful. But that's quite overt, right? Because it happens, it's usually at home and at the church. So there might be some breaks for someone at school. There might be some breaks for them in their sports team, whatever. If you imagine the man box occurs and starts occurring to a man before he's born. We talk to boys and girls differently, even when they're in the womb. By the time they come out, we talk to them differently. Boys get less physical touch by the time they're 3 years old. It's like a staggering statistic that how much less that they get, right? So we're already telling boys that they don't deserve love in the same way that women do and girls do, right? We start telling them that their production, they're good boys, that they done well because they did something, right? We start telling girls that they're pretty, and they start to reinforce their worth around their looks from a very young age. So to get out of it, it takes a monumental effort, right? It takes, and it also takes, has to be, feel like there's a really solid incentive, right? Because inside the manosphere, the idea that, you know, to simplistically put, like, we're in an oppressive system, which is true. We're in an oppressive system. Unfortunately, they attribute it to maybe the wrong places, you know, women, feminism, and so forth. But that a man needs to be good looking, have money, and have status to be successful, right? The thing is there's some truth in this, right? In what the Manosphere is saying. It's not like it's a complete lie, you know, like there's some truth in it. We see it with our eyes. Men who are good looking, they end up with more opportunities in love and relationship, dating, should we say, or more attention. Men with money seem to have more opportunities. They seem to be more confident. They seem to have more access to other wealth and access to influence. That's also true, right? We see that with our own eyes. The problem is that the simplistic nature of the way that they describe that is all that's important. And the removal of the importance of character, you know? And I think what it feels like more and more, because I definitely, the manosphere has existed in many ways. You know, when I was working in the pickup world, you know, to some degree, that is the manosphere morphed out of the pickup world in many ways, right? And it was what it is where we reduce very complex interactions and ideas into very simplistic things that we try and explain with simplistic answers. We miss all the nuance, but also if I'm taking my evidence for how I'm describing the world from very immature people. So like, I remember The Game, and then I'm reading The Truth by Neil Strauss, which I think is a tremendous book, right? It really touched me, that book. If I'm doing a social experiment and the only women I'm doing that social experiment with is women who are between 18 and 25 who are in Hollywood clubs and bars, I'm not getting a good spread of human beings who are mature in their 30s and 40s. So if I decide this is how dating and relationships are based on my collection of 19, 20-year-old women, I'm going to get a really, really skewed, not even skewed, it's going to be a very superficial look. You know, if we think to ourselves, like, who was I attracted to when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, right? To some degree, we were attracted to superficial things because we're superficial, right? So the thing is, the manosphere does get some truths right, but what they miss out is the fact that when we start to mature and we get older and we start to know ourselves a bit better and we start to think about purpose and meaning and families, the things that people are attracted to and the people that people are attracted to become very, very different. Right. And the thing with a lot of the guys in the manosphere is what they've done is they've held on to their beliefs that they formed when they were 18, 19 years old, and they've created a whole world around it, which attracts lots of boys who are 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, and also some that are older, because that's what they're experiencing. They can see that. But what it negates is the complexity of human love, the complexity of human connection, the complexity of a world that is incredibly complex. You know, but the key to getting men out of the manosphere is actually feeling and compassion, right? For themselves, compassion for themselves, but also the wider world. So if I can start feeling the experience of a woman more and more, and curiosity and depth into who she is, I start to see that this manosphere content, though feels true on the surface sometimes, is actually very deeply incorrect in the long term or on a deeper level of experience, diversity of people, talking to different types of people, travel. Like, I have a little brother who's 19 and I'm basically just trying to harass him to travel constantly because I know how transformative travel is, because you go to a country full of people who you've heard about. And then you speak to those people and you're like, wow, these people are just like me. Wow, I really enjoyed the company of these people. So if more men find themselves in the mix of groups of people, it will break down the ideas they have about the manosphere, because they will hear people's real experience instead of just listening to Myron Gaines tell you about how women are. You'll experience how women are for yourself. And then you'll start to go, wait, these rules I've been taught aren't the truth, and I need to really question them.
And I guess at that point, man is potentially diving into his shadows, his stuff, the way that he is showing up, which requires self-awareness, empathy. I guess that's, also where the man box potentially comes in, right? Because, what are we being told now? Empathy is the weakness of humanity.
Yeah.
My husband, who is always coming up against this barrier of men saying, I'm fine, and not wanting to ask for help. And, I'm curious how you, within your work, within your business, aim to bridge that gap of, getting a man kind of like over the line of, I'm fine and I'm just going to keep going like this, to no, there's stuff here that I want to look at. How do you aim to bridge that gap?
I guess I bridge that gap in the way of they come to me because they want something.
Yeah.
Men come and they want something, right? They want love, they want connection, they want better dating lives and so forth. And obviously they've listened to my content and they like the ethos I have. When someone wants something, you can go, okay, I can help you get this thing. You can take them on a journey that's meandering and winding, that you can give them quick wins, and then you can give them the stuff they really need, right? You can say, okay, here's some tactics that are going to help you in dating. That's going to have an impact. Like, how do you communicate and express yourself? And then you can sneak in some emotional work, as well as some attunement work. Like, how does a woman respond to you when you talk to her? Notice, really, you start slipping in that work. And then you start to see, all it takes is like, oh, you have a belief. Oh, you have some beliefs about yourself. Can you see that that's not true, that you're not going to be rejected all the time? And then once you get someone into that stage, you can start bringing in like the inner child work, because you're like, where did this belief come from? And they're like, oh, when I was 14, this girl told me I was ugly. You're like, okay, can we look at that a little bit? They're like, yeah, close your eyes, sir. Let's get in, and then you can get into the mother and the father wounds, and you can get into like the fears they've been holding on to. You can do some of the parts work. You can start to go there because there's a certain level of trust he has with you and you've helped him. But also when he starts to delve into these things, he touches this aspect of himself and he starts to feel better in the moment. This is a really vital thing. It's like, if you take a man to feel his unexpressed anger that he has for his father, right? And then you ask him afterwards, like, how do you feel afterwards? And they're like, man, I feel like 2 tons has been lifted from me. You're like, great, good to hear. It's just that reinforcement, like, this stuff helps. This makes a difference. This makes me feel better now. Reinforces the benefit and the goodness of this work. And then they start to see the results outwardly in their life. Like, people tell them, man, you seem really present. And then once you're in that loop, then it's like, okay, I want results, and I see I'm getting results. The problem is if the beginning where people are like, I'm fine, I don't need any help, those are very hard people to touch and reach, because they're not really aware that there's a problem. But if people have a problem, or they have a desired result they have, then you can work with that. But when people are like, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong, which is the kind of modern stoic archetype of man, like, I'm fine, nothing's wrong, I can push through this because I don't feel anything, because I'm a brain walking around on a stick. Like, then it's very hard to help them. There must be some pain. There must be some pain or some lack.
Yeah, because, just going back to the moment that, because when you had that breakup and you painted that picture of, the emotions and the thoughts that were coming up, for you, if I don't want to be here again, I feel back into moments that I've had back in my 20s of kind of not being happy at work, noticing that my relationships were always leading down the same garden path, and getting to this point where it's like, I need to look at me. It must be something that I'm doing. That's kind of like step number 1, isn't it? Of like, well, I'm going to look at my stuff. And then, I recognize that, I suppose, as someone that was socialized as a woman, it was much easier for me to go and seek out a therapist, to go to yoga, to learn to meditate, to go to silent retreat. The stuff that helped me in the beginning and also continues to help me today, I didn't have so much pushback, I guess, and a man might do. So I recognize that is a big challenge for some men. And I also, from spending lots of time with women, I understand that there is often a frustration that can come up, I suppose, for women who have done a lot of work, quote unquote, on themselves, and seeking partners who also, have quote unquote, done the work. And there being this kind of misrepresentation because it has been easier potentially for women to have access into kind of healing spaces, personal development spaces, and men not going kind of quite so far down that track at the same level of time. I know that that can bring up challenges for people. And I'm curious, how you see us being able to hold that in relationship together, that frustration.
Yeah. But if I knew a solution that worked 60% of the time for people in relationship, especially a woman is doing the work and the man's not, to solve that and have him do the work, I think I'd be a billionaire by now. It's one of those common questions I've asked guests of mine, especially people who work with couples. Yeah. How do we hold it? Man, it's a really difficult one, right? On multiple levels, because there's the dating aspect, and then there's people in relationship, and then there's just kind of the general narrative, right? So there's in dating, what's really funny is my clients, men who do the work, they struggle to find women who are doing the work.
I know loads. Yeah? If they ever need any.
They struggle to find women that are doing the work. And then my partner is also a coach, and I speak to her women. They're like, well, I'm struggling to find men who are doing the work. I'm not saying we repel each other, but you can do the work, and what really it starts to get into the really subtle unconscious. It's like, but you might have read all your books. You might have read of Attached. Yeah. You might have read about that. You understand about your attachment style. You might understand about feminine energy and feminine embodiment. And you might have been to see a therapist for 3 years. But are you still attracted to the same type of man?
Yes.
Are you still attracted to the same type of man? Maybe that man doesn't treat you as badly because you got boundaries now, right? And you have a bit more self-worth. But really underneath, are you still attracted to the same sort of man? And this goes for men. Are you still attracted to the same sort of woman? That becomes your primary problem. And it's very easy for us to go, wow, I've done the work. There's no good men. But it's like, well, who are you attracted to? Because when you're swiping on your dating app, remember this, there's some really nice guys there, right? But you don't choose those guys. You choose not to choose them. You don't choose to be not attracted to them, right? Unconsciously, your brain is not wired to be attracted to those men. And you have to ask yourself some really hard questions. Why that is? Why is it when you go to a party and you meet all these different people, that the guy who maybe is slightly quiet and maybe a little bit boring, but very safe and very calm isn't attractive to you? Because if that's the thing you actually say you want, why do you keep attracted to the man who doesn't treat you well or who is emotionally shut down? Because we all get the same, especially women, they get an imprint of what a man should be like through their fathers, through society. And then, you have to contend with that, because that's like a really subtle bit of work, which when I do it with men, I'm almost like a drill sergeant. I'm like, what values do you want to see in somebody? That's what you want to see in somebody. So when you go out and you go to a dating event, or when you are at some sort of conscious event, you are scanning your conversations for, does this person feel like they're meeting the values that I have? But when we're in a relationship with someone and they're not doing the work, this can be so painful. And I've spoken to so many men, and I've spoken to women about it as well. And sometimes, I've got clients who are like married for 20 years and they're like, my partner, she won't do the work. She is still emotionally volatile. She shouts at the kids. She shouts at me. She doesn't listen. She won't look at her stuff. She thinks the past is pointless looking at. And you have to come to a certain point. It's like, well, if they didn't change at all, could you still be happy? And sometimes people are like, no. And if it's a no, then you kind of have an answer for what you want to do, right? And that becomes your responsibility. And that's painful, right? Because sometimes leaving is the answer, and sometimes leaving is incredibly painful. And I also say this, I have seen many a man come to my doorstep, come to my little Zoom room where we have our first call, because their partner has packed her bags and walked out the door and said it's over. And that spurs a man in ways often, right, that he was never motivated before. And I'm not saying you should threaten to leave your partner to get him to do the work, because you have to be willing to follow through. But I think it's, you can do a lot of cajoling. Some men do listen to their partners. Some men will you sit him down and say, look, these things that you do, the defensiveness, the shutting down, these things are hurting me. They're hurting you. They're hurting the children. This is one that I see can be a really firm one. This is what your dad did. You've told me this, and this is what you're going to pass on to your son. Is this what you want to do? Can be a way to word it, but it's such a delicate thing because it can just feel like an attack sometimes. So it's hard to get them to do it. But the truth is, I've seen men do listen sometimes. Not always. They need to feel, men change through pain, which is such a pain in the ass because they change through pain. And like you said, the template we have for women has expanded through, feminism, through the sexual revolution of what we think a woman can be. In that time, on a global scale, the template of a man has not changed. We still expect a man to be a provider. We still expect him to be an emotionally stunted man. Really, we do. We still laugh at men if they cry, publicly. We might internally say, oh, it's okay, but we feel some sort of, initially, that first response. How we see men hasn't changed. So to go and do that work, which is going to leave him at some point having to face difficulty and pain and mean that he might not be able to be the rock he was before, and you have to challenge his whole ideas of who he is and what it means to be a man. You don't reward men in society for doing that work. We do not. We reward men for working hard and making money, right? And shutting up and getting on with things. That's how society rewards men. So it's not easy. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does. Do people who are doing the work meet together? Yes, they do. I see it all the time. The question then becomes, when you put them in a room together, because I've seen this, I put 12 people, 6 men, 6 women, all single, and the men are there, they're doing the work. The women are there doing the work. How often are they actually attracted to each other mutually? And it's very interesting to observe. It's very interesting to observe how often someone will be like, oh, they're nice, but I didn't really feel the spark with them. And you're like, wow, this is the man or woman that you say you want. And I know because you tell me on phone calls, but yet when they're right in front of you, you're not interested. And I think that's something that as humans, as people, we have to look very, very close at ourselves about.
Yeah. And the lies that we grew up with watching TV shows and stuff about dating. I'm the person that I dated before I met my husband. When it finished, and it finished in a really explosive, awful way. And my therapist said, how did you actually feel when you were around him? And I was like, really out of my body and really kind of high almost. And she was like, so you felt dysregulated. That's how you felt all of the time around him. And I was like, no, it was chemistry. It's total chemistry. She was like, no. When you meet somebody who is a safe person for you to be with, you will feel grounded, regulated. This is how you should feel. That's the opposite to, it should be like sparks and lightning and all of the things. I joke with my husband now that when we say to each other, what was the point where you knew that I was your person? For me, I always joke that it was on our third date, because on our third date, I literally had a thought of, he's boring. But it was only because my nervous system was so relaxed and grounded that it was like, oh, this is a safe person for me to be with. But you're right in that my whole system was so calibrated to chaos and, all of the kind of explosive, dramatic aspects of kind of relationship, that stability was very strange to my nervous system. So yes, I can definitely relate to that one. You mentioned the how we still have this template for men. Do you feel like that template is changing?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. There's some research that came out recently. It came out on International Women's Day, where they polled, I think it's 29 or 39 countries, and 30% of Gen Z men felt that their wives should obey them. 30% of Gen Z people, I don't think it's men, I think it's Gen Z people, also self-identify as feminist. Highest of all demographics, right, that they polled. I think what's happening is we are, because of the nature of how our world is becoming, we're polarizing. So I think at one end, I think you are seeing a lot of people go back to more conservative and more traditional views. They're trying to create stability in an uncertain world, but doesn't have rules. So they're trying to grapple onto the rules that are there. And I think at the other end, people are becoming even more liberal, a bit more free with themselves. So, some of the spaces that I find myself in, I do see people being more, women, for instance, being more concerned with how gentle a man is, his ability to communicate, his potential for being a good father, things like that. I think that is definitely happening. And we're also seeing people go back to church. I'm seeing a lot of people on my own Instagram over these years, since COVID, to be honest, who are like, I'm a born again Christian again. And I'm like, wow, you was a Tantra teacher 2 weeks ago, And I'm not saying there's two things, you can't believe in God and Jesus and also practice Tantra. I'm not saying that, but it's like I'm just seeing this polarizing and we're shifting into camps. So I think that we are breaking down the idea of what it means to be a man and shifting that. And some institutions and some people are actually rebuilding and fortifying that idea at the same time. And it can
Wow.
feel, for a man, you could just go onto Instagram now and you go, okay, what does it mean to be a man? And I was down a rabbit hole a couple of days ago looking at videos of Andrew Tate. And he was like, be strong, power through, do whatever you need to do, take what you need. And then you can go to another video, what it means to be a man, which is to be like multidimensional, be able to hold space, emotionally attuned, like caring, kind, blah, blah, blah. And you could sit there and be like, wow, I'm really confused.
Yeah.
And I think that confusion makes you quite ripe for searching out very clear rules. So I think that we are seeing the breaking down of the old idea of being a man. And we're also seeing the fortifying of it. And we have to start to do there's like this really subtle work that I've noticed in myself, which is, okay, give me a good example. When my son Bjorn was born, we bought him this little changing mat, which we still have. It just rolls out. It's on the sofa and it's pink. I was advised by people, if you're going to get a little changing mat, a good friend of mine, actually, he's like, don't get a big changing table. You don't need one. Get a small one. And I found one and it was for swimming, which is really good because it's like waterproof and, kids, they pee and shit everywhere. And it's pink. And there was a part of me when I saw it was like, it's pink. Am I going to buy this? And that still occurred in me like, ooh. And then I bought it. But you see that pause there, that is the indoctrination that I've received about being a man. I'm conscious that occurred. If I wasn't conscious of that, maybe I would have gone, I don't really like that one. I don't really like that one. I'm going to search for another one. But, it could be that, and this isn't necessarily gender specific, but for a woman, you're standing in front of a man and he starts to emote his sadness and he starts to emote his pain. And you might feel uncomfortable about that, and you might rationalize that as men's lives are easy. Like, why is he complaining? Right? Or you might rationalize it as like, oh, shit, look, this is my own internal patriarchy. And I get to meet this and actually go, no, he's deserving of his expression, right? And we can rationalize it anyway, but it's these subtle little ways that it comes up. I think we still box in men, maybe as a man, you meet a woman and she earns more money than you. And you know it. You meet her, you sit down, she tells you her job title and you're thinking, wow, she's probably earning 3-4 times as much as me. Are you able to just meet her as she is, or are you still uncomfortable about being around her because she has more money than you? And this is the kind of internalized patriarchy that we need to root out in the subtle ways in ourselves. I definitely think it's changing. I just think that there's subtlety we can easily, those subtle emotions and feelings we feel inside, we can attribute those to things we can rationalize as a way to still make ourselves look conscious.
Yeah, makes so much sense. I'm curious for you as a man, as a partner, as a father, as a facilitator of the work that you do. We are existing, as you've just outlined, in pretty turbulent times. The polarization that we are seeing, the release of the Epstein files and the fallout of that over the past months, the national state of emergency around violence against women and gender-based violence. How do you feel, as a man, as a father, as a partner, amidst all of this? How are you experiencing all of this personally, would you say?
It's a real mix, isn't it? Because, just the Epstein files, I haven't delved into the website and started pulling out bits and pieces. I go through these phases of I can just read a news article and I'm like, I'm disgusted. And then I'm compassionate. And then I'm trying to understand, okay, I know what Deepak Chopra said to Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm like, I'm trying to understand it from Deepak's point of view, what he's saying. And then I'm a bit yeah, but man, you was a big man then, So I'm in this disgusted understanding, trying to understand the other person's perspective. But it's also quite chaotic to be shifting through these different emotional spaces.
Yeah.
And I think with the violence against women, this touched me quite early in life because a friend of mine at university was raped at university and we were really close. And I also knew her through the trial and I knew how the trial panned out. I think we spoke, maybe not every day, but we spoke as the trial was happening. And it was my first experience of realizing how the justice system fails victims of sexual assault and rape so badly, so horrendously. And I'm not even a woman. I'm just a man observing from the outside. And how easy it is for a man to commit a crime of sexual assault and think that he hasn't done anything wrong, because we are taught in this way around entitlement of women's bodies in these very subtle ways, right? She's playing hard to get. That was what I heard a lot when I was young. When I go back to my early 20s, she's playing hard to get, which is a horrible phrase. And God knows how much horrible things have occurred because man thought that. But it's all happening and it's all really fucking horrible, but you also feel powerless, you know, like you can feel really powerless as a man. And also there's a level of this, I think we probably don't talk about as men very often, is like, there's also like, have I done any of this stuff? You know, when I did a Vipassana a couple of years ago, and the question that came into my head and would not leave my head for about 3 or 4 days. And if you're sitting silently meditating for 3 or 4 days and you don't have any other questions in your head, like that question gets a lot of airtime. Was like, is there a woman out there that believes that I raped or sexually assaulted her? Is a woman out there? Can I be sure of the answer? And I, after days of meditating on it, which caused me all sorts of like anxiety and stress, was like, I can't be sure. I cannot be sure, right? I believe I've acted with good intentions. I've done a lot of drinking in my life, a lot of partying, a lot of sex while drunk. I have my perspective. Someone else could have a very different perspective. And that's something that could be true. And I think that is a place that men instinctively feel when they think about violence against women, sexual violence against women, is like, and we usually meet that with defensiveness. So we either go, I'm not like those other men, right? We push away that feelings of that shame, that guilt, that uncomfortability, or we minimize the experience we're hearing about the woman, because then we can remove ourselves we can back into that avoidance. We can avoid the feelings that we don't want to experience. And I think this is and then that can come in the guise for men of like wanting to then do whataboutism. Like, oh, what about misandry? And you're like, yeah, misandry's happening, dude. But like, men ain't dying because of misandry, you know? Yeah, it's really horrible and it's going to pollute people's minds and it's probably hurting women as well. But in this very moment, you know, men aren't going out there, women aren't going out there because they hate men and beating them, attacking them, raping them, taking advantage of them. Like, that's not happening. They're on Instagram shouting about it, like that they hate men. That's like kind of the crux of it. So it's a very different thing. So I think there's a lot of deflection. So it's like having to be able to be with all these feelings about what's happening in the world, I think for people is, and myself, back to myself, is really emotionally taxing and quite dysregulating. And I think it creates a lot of internal chaos on ourselves, or we do the thing that a lot of people do, is we just deflect it all and go, it's not my problem. It's nothing to do with me. And then we can create a little bit of peace internally. So I think it's a really, at this present moment in time, like, I do get the feeling sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm not doing enough, you know? I should do more. Like, I should talk more about violence against women and girls. And I sat with a couple of friends talking about this, and my justification, I think it's a justification, explanation, is that my work by proxy in helping men feel more, connect more, humanize themselves, compassion, humanize the women they're with, is in fact, I believe, is supporting the reduction of violence against women and girls. You know, I speak to people about my podcast and so forth, because if men can love more deeply and they can love more honestly and be themselves, like if you're compassionate towards yourselves and you're empathetic towards yourself and other people and compassionate towards other people, committing such a crime, right, as rape, sexual assault, violence against women, becomes a lot more difficult for you to do, because you have to hold a lot of hate or a lot of entitlement or some very rigid beliefs that allow you to disconnect from the harm you're doing or the hurt you're potentially doing. And I think that's the really important work actually for men and especially young men and men. But it is painful to see, because, you know, I don't know a woman, I haven't dated a woman who hasn't told me about some level of rape, sexual assault since I was about 22. That hasn't told me. And, you know, I pride myself on being a space to listen. And I mean, every girlfriend I've had, and I think if most men were able to have that conversation with the women that they knew, and there's back to that problem with the Manosphere men, they don't speak to women, that would shift their perspective on this, right? Because they would suddenly be like, oh God, you're my sister, you're my girlfriend, you're the woman in front of me, and you're telling me this story and I can feel it and it's uncomfortable and it's painful and I understand your experience. And now I can multiply that by millions of women and I'll be like overwhelmed maybe with that feeling. And I may feel less defensive against it, but they still have to work with that piece. So it's heavy, man. It's heavy at this time. And it's like how to find peace in that heaviness, how to find some hope for the world, for self, for that things are getting better. I do think on a global scale, as much as it doesn't feel like it, I think we're trending towards positivity, better outcomes on a whole, on a very general scale.
I also think that we are trending in I have to hold on to the idea that we are trending in the right direction. I just think it's going to be really fucking messy all the way.
Yeah.
But I do hold on to that hope. Just speaking of hope, what does give you hope at this time, or what fortifies your sense of hope at this time?
I think what gives me hope, you can look at the demonstration that happened on the weekend about anti-far right demonstrations. You can see that. You can see the global, not just attention, but the global backing of Free Palestine. You can look at the amount of allyship that's occurring in terms of violence against women and girls. You've got people going into schools. Like, I know so many men who go into schools and talk about respect, that talk about aspiration, that talk to young men and women, right? About how to be better citizens in the world. Like, there's so much of this work that's happening, but no one's going to put it on the news week after week, because it doesn't rage bait us. It doesn't make us angry. So I think it's often just remember that as humans, we have a negative bias, and that there's a lot of hopeful things happening. They just don't land on us in the same way, because we're being trained more and more into rage reactions and anger reactions instead of reactions of compassion. Like, I think with the one thing I think is concerning in many aspects of life is the way in which we are losing our capacity for compassion for people, just based on some aspect of their not beingness, but like their race, their nationality, where they were born, whether they are immigrants or not immigrants, whether they're a man or they're a woman. We're losing more and more ability to be compassionate towards a somebody or even a group, just purely based on one kind of identifying factor about them. And I think that's one thing that's worrying, and I see how that impacts people's relationships and dating lives a lot as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think, you're totally right with the negative bias, which is also kind of perpetuated, exactly as you said, in the media headlines. I was at the march on Saturday, and the atmosphere was amazing. And when Casper, my husband, had been away for the weekend, unfortunately, and he came back and he was like, "How was it?" And I was like, "Yeah, it was great." And then looking at all the headlines the next day, we were laughing and just being like, why is it that every single headline has to like find the thing that is wrong with it in some kind of way, rather than just like 500,000 people in Britain show up like out of neighbourly community? Like, that could have been a headline, But no, the headlines are usually the opposite. But no, I think you're totally right. And I often feel the same of kind of when I fall into that place of powerlessness or despair or anything, it's remembering the people out there doing the work and that good things are happening in all places. Thank you so much for the conversation today. Is there anything that you wanted to add to the end of our conversation, or anything that you wanted to share?
I think, just in this compassion piece is like, how can you be more compassionate towards yourself, people?
Yeah.
Listeners, more than anything, towards yourself, because that is such a powerful thing to do. But also other people, you just never know. It's not justification for people's actions, but you never know what's led someone to do the thing that's happening right now in front of you that you dislike. To saying the horrible thing online that you see. There's someone I follow. First name's Alok. I can't remember their surname. I can't remember. And
I know who you mean.
They meet the most horrible comments about them on Instagram with such compassion that I can only aspire to, and because that anger you feel towards people, it only eats you. It doesn't eat other people. It eats you. So just like give yourself a bit of compassion. And compassion does not mean you remove accountability or responsibility. It's just a way to soften yourself for yourself, not the other person.
Totally. Such a good reminder. And I will definitely be thinking of that the next time that I also get negative comments. Thank you so much for the conversation, David. I really appreciate your time and your energy. And all of the information to connect with you will be in the show notes. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.